You can support us with the Super Thanks button below. Ukraine's path to victory passes through the Pearl of the Black Sea. Crimea. Crimea is a key and has a decisive role in this war. Ukraine wants to open its doors to freedom using the Crimean Key. For this purpose, Ukraine is organizing many attacks on Russian positions in Crimea. The last of these was deployed to the second-largest Russian military airbase in the Crimea. So how did the Ukrainian attacks reach the Russian military airbase 240 kilometers from the front line in the Crimea? As Divine Justice, we strive to bring you the most striking news, collective and accurate information from the front. Working 24/7 with our expert staff in the fastest way possible, you can subscribe to support us. Unmanned aerial vehicles belonging to Ukraine managed to frighten Vladimir Putin by making a show of strength in the skies of Crimea. The last of these attacks occurred around 1620 local time in the airbase area in Gaverdiysk in Crimea, which was temporarily occupied by Russia last day. Mysterious Ukrainian weapons struck and blew up the military airbase 240 kilometers from Russia's front line in Crimea. Local residents reported that explosions were heard and seen again in the temporarily occupied Crimea, this time in the area of the military airbase in the urban-type village of Gaverdiysk in Simferopol district. According to local reports, first, a few explosions were heard, then black smoke appeared above the airbase. According to claims by Russian officials, Russian air defense systems hit the UAV. In addition, a large crater was allegedly found at the scene. The diameter of the crater is about 10 to 12 meters, and the depth is about 3.5. The military airbase in the village of Gaverdiysk received another incurable wound with the attacks by the mysterious vehicles of Ukraine. It is likely that the heroes who carried out this attack were bomb-laden drones when the bombs dropped from the drones hit the military airbase. Huge explosions occurred, and the skies of Crimea surrounded to the dark cloud. The Russian authorities have not yet made a statement regarding the casualties resulting from the attack. However, considering the ammunition and soldiers at the airbase, it is a strong possibility that there will be serious casualties. However, it was not specified from which direction the drone flew. Given that the aircraft has successfully covered such a long distance both from the borders of Ukraine and over the territory of Russia, Ukrainian drones cause serious concerns for Russian officials. The determined stance of the Kiev administration on Crimea is fueling a series of cross-border operations. In addition to the Gaverdiysk attack, Sevastopol and Bakhchisaroy near Yalta hosted explosions in Berkshire. The engineering warehouse of the military unit of the 758th Logistics Center of the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet and the warehouse of the 133rd Brigade of the M2 were located. Ukrainian drones targeted these Russian ammunition depots. As a result of the missiles hitting, large clouds of smoke were seen in the skies of Bakhchisaroy. The explosion was so strong that the terrifying explosions were heard in many villages of Bakhchisaroy district. No official statement has yet been made regarding the casualties caused by the explosion. In addition, according to the claims of Russian state media, air defense systems shot down 6 unmanned aerial vehicles while electronic warfare systems disabled 4. The Russian Ministry of Defense, which is uneasy about the frequent flying of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles over the skies of Crimea, attracted all the attention with its statements. In his official statement, the Russian defense minister stated that Ukraine is targeting the civilian infrastructure in Crimea and in the depths of Russia. The Ukrainian front did not remain indifferent to these statements. One of Zelensky's chief advisors, Mikhailo Podolyak, denied that Ukraine used drones to attack Russian territory. Writing on the Twitter social media platform, Podolyak said Ukraine is not attacking the territory of the Russian Federation. Ukraine is waging a defensive war to liberate all of its lands from occupation. In addition, Ukraine's Western allies deterred Ukraine from attacking targets in Russia to prevent the conflict from escalating. Mr. Podolyak's statement may reflect Kiev's attempt to maintain a degree of deniability in light of these Western concerns. At the beginning of the video, we asked you a question: can Ukraine open its doors to freedom using the Crimean Key? The answer to this question would most likely be yes, given the Kiev forces' operations in Crimea. So what strategies can Ukraine use to liberate Crimea? Let's consider these tactics together. To liberate Crimea means to make the peninsula untenable for the Russian army, navy, and air force, A large-scale offensive accompanied by precision strikes and shelling against Russian air, ground and naval forces could help drive Putin's men out of Crimea. This concerto attack on the peninsula would be a major blow to Russia's morale to isolate and neutralize it and seriously damage its military infrastructure with long-range attacks in the absence of decisive war success. Elsewhere, the liberation of Crimea would mean an undisguised defeat for Moscow and could lead to the collapse of Russian forces on the ground and even the downfall of Putin. In addition, Kiev can isolate the omni-terrestrial communication line connecting Crimea to Russia using long-range precision strikes. Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to Russia via Mariupol and Melitopol along the Azov Sea coastline. This bridge is very important in the land communication line. Targeting this transport infrastructure will initiate the isolation of Crimea from supplier movement. Let us remind you that the Kerch Bridge was severely damaged months ago. A large Ukrainian armored force attacking southeast in the direction of the Sea of Azov and penetrating the Russian linear defenses will complete the isolation of Crimea and enable the closer deployment of HIMARS rocket launchers, which will then be within range of key Russian installations in Crimea. Crimea is the size of Massachusetts. There is no place to hide. The location of all Russian facilities are well known. Russian facilities are open and vulnerable, while on the other hand, sensitive attacks on Sevastopol may force the Black Sea Fleet to relocate to Novorossiysk, which is much less capable as a base and is further away from Ukrainian cities. If Ukraine wants Crimea, it must make the Saki airbase on the west coast of Crimea completely unusable. The logistics center in Onkawi in the north of Crimea should turn into a huge bonfire once Crimea becomes untenable. Ukrainian ground forces may begin to attack south to the Isthmus of Perekop and then to the wider Crimea. Special forces, Marines, unmanned systems are assets that will play an important role in Ukraine's Crimean operation. We touched upon the strategies that Ukraine will use to liberate Crimea. However, another detail that is as important as strategy in war is ammunition for the Crimean offensive. Ukraine needs long-range attack capabilities such as the Attack, a surface-to-surface missile with a range of 190 miles. The West will also need to provide other equipment that will allow the Ukrainians to deploy a large armored force capable of penetrating enemy lines without being blown up by mines or stranded in trenches dug by Russians. But there is no consensus among Western countries on providing Ukraine with long-range weapons. Few believe that Russia will resort to a tactical nuclear strike, but many worry that any weapon that could potentially be used by Ukraine to launch an attack inside Russia's territory could increase the risk of escalation and plunge other Western countries into a direct war. As a result, Zelensky realized that the Crimean Union must now be cauterized. Failure to retake the peninsula would mean an ongoing threat to Ukrainian state identity and global security. Zelensky continues to fight with all his might to destroy these threats. With Ukraine's determination to retake Crimea and Russia's insistence that it will defend it, it may only be a matter of time before this conflict turns into a battlefield reality. Every job has a trick. To be a successful chess player, you need to make the right moves at the right time in the right area. This can make things much easier. Sometimes a job that would take days can be finished in seconds if done correctly. This is also the case in war. The Ukrainian army has gained a huge military superiority today, operating in very strategic areas. This operation left the Russian army completely helpless. As anchored Daily News team, we have reported all the details about this legendary operation of the Ukrainian army for you. We look forward to your support for the continuation of independent journalism. You can support us by using the Super Thanks button below the video. The Russian army is facing a major logistical problem in its invasion in Ukraine because the Russian army did not have enough technical information for this operation. Russian soldiers did not know the location of large military depots in Ukraine and the roads between these depots. The Ukrainian army, thanks to its sudden operations, has largely cut the connection routes between the military bases of the Russian army. The Russian army had constant difficulties in transporting ammunition. Ukrainian troops set up checkpoints at crossroads of highways. Russian tanks could not pass through these areas. This also had a major impact on the coordination between the Russian army on some fronts. There was a large number of tanks and weapons, while on others the Russian army was in very poor condition. The Ukrainian army aimed to do this by controlling the crossroads. One after another, operations were carried out in all areas where the Russian army lacked ammunition, Russian bases which lacked sufficient weapons, and troops were captured one by one. Thanks to these strategic operations, as the Ukrainian army gained a huge advantage in this war. On the other hand, the Ukrainian military monitored all Russian military activities with drones. Russia's attack plans were thus exposed. However, the Russian military never found out in which region Ukraine was going to operate. Putin was always in for bad surprises. The Ukrainian army also destroyed railway systems. The destruction of these systems caused great damage to Russia's ammunition shipments because Russia was planning to transport tanks by rail. To prevent this, Zelensky decided to destroy the Ukrainian railways. Zelensky said the following in his statement on this issue: all roads, rails, bridges and houses will be rebuilt. For that, we must first win our independence. Zelensky is waging a historic struggle for Ukraine's independence. He is making all the sacrifices for this. He has been showing extraordinary success since the beginning of the war. Zelensky has won the admiration of the world. Journalists who went to Zelensky's office on the first anniversary of the war found something interesting. Zelensky had been living in a small room in his office since the beginning of the war. Zelensky, who constantly cheered the soldiers and led a successful diplomacy, became a great hero for Ukraine. In the process, millions of people around the world admire Zelensky. Zelensky became Putin's nightmare. The Ukrainian army prepared another very nasty surprise for Putin today. For several days, the Russian army has been building up its stockpile of ammunition to launch a new operation. In particular, ammunition was collected in 6 different warehouses. These warehouses contained a large number of missiles. Tank shells and machine guns were also sent to the warehouses. The Russian army thought that this shipment of ammunition was done in secret. The Russian army did not transport these munitions in military trucks because it knew that these trucks would be followed by the Ukrainian army. Instead, these weapons were loaded onto military vehicles and transported continuously for a week. The Russian military was confident that this shipment was carried out in secret. However, Ukrainian intelligence was suspicious of the activity in the Russian army. Ukrainian authorities tracked these vehicles with drones and realized that Russia was preparing for a new attack. However, the Ukrainian army decided not to shoot down the vehicles carrying ammunition. It was a very risky decision, but the Ukrainian authorities have never been afraid to take risks. Since the beginning of the war, they have successfully completed all operations. They had a different plan for this operation. Instead of shooting vehicles carrying ammunition, the Ukrainian army decided to destroy ammunition depots. For this, they waited for the ammunition shipment to end because they thought that more weapons could be destroyed in this way. After a week of deliveries, the Russian army had completely filled the warehouses. Now, the final preparations were being made to launch a new offensive. That's when the Ukrainian army moved in. The coordinates of the Russian army's warehouses full of ammunition were shared with HIMARS. HIMARS missiles launched simultaneous attacks on these depots. These depots were located in Mariupol, Donetsk, Makiivka, Kharkiv, Debaltseve, and Novosilsk regions. The simultaneous operation in so many different areas drove the Russian commanders crazy. The Russian army could do nothing against this operation. The Ukrainian army inflicted heavy damage on Russia. The largest of these warehouses was located in the city of Mariupol. This city, located in the south of Donetsk Oblast, is one of the key points of the war. The Russian army is advancing from this region and establishing a road connection with Crimea. After liberating Mariupol, the Ukrainian army plans to head towards Crimea. Mariupol became important after the Kerch Bridge. The land link between Crimea and Russia exploded. The Russian army wants to continue the occupation of Mariupol in order to reach Crimea, but the Ukrainian army does not allow this. Fighting continues in Mariupol. The Ukrainian army is planning to liberate Crimea to end this war, because Crimea is one of the most important points in this war. But what makes Crimea so important? Putin invaded Crimea in 2014. Since then, the Ukrainian government has been making efforts to liberate Crimea. After Zelensky became Ukraine's president, there were more attempts to do so. However, this situation changed after the Russian army attacked the whole of Ukraine. Zelensky said that the Ukrainian army would enter Crimea and liberate the city. One of Zelensky's statements on this issue turned into a slogan for independence. Zelensky said the war started in Crimea. It will end in Crimea. Crimea is very important for Putin's image. When Putin invaded Crimea, there was constant propaganda about it in Russia. Putin was presented as a hero. If the Ukrainian army succeeds in liberating Crimea, Putin's reputation will suffer a huge blow. This situation scares Putin very much. The liberation of Crimea could end Putin's political career in Russia. This could lead to the end of the war. That is why the Ukrainian army is making great efforts to liberate Crimea. Crimea will be the most violent region of the war in the coming days. After the destruction of the ammunition depots, the Russian army is no longer capable of fighting in Crimea. The Ukrainian army has gained a clear strategic advantage thanks to this major operation. Putin is completely helpless. The most intense fights took place in the east here. Due to the recent snowfall and rain, all clashes moved from the fields to the city. Russians took advantage of the increased availability of artillery and focused their fire on the central part of the city. However, such abuse of artillery put a stick in the will of the Russian assault units because all it led to was the creation of a pile of rubble that separated Ukrainian and Russian positions. Last time I told you that Russian forces secured new gains in the central part of the region and started expanding outwards. I also told you that whenever Ukrainians are forced to step back, they tried to make sure to mine and blow up important buildings to prevent the Russians from improving their tactical position. Yesterday night, the head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, announced that they had successfully reached another street in the central part of the region, established total control over the city hall, and raised Russian and Wagner flags on top of it. Later, it was revealed that the city hall was completely demolished and the Russian flag was stuck in the pile of rubble. For now, it is not known whether it was destroyed by an explosion or artillery or other means. It is possible that due to heavy fighting, the Devils did not withstand the fire and collapsed. And the fights in the central part of the city are incredibly heavy. Wagner forces have to deal with battles for each house in their way, and each building is a well-fortified position because Ukrainians started digging trenches on the main streets already in December. The head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, said that the tempo of advance is slow because each window is a potential firing point and a machine gun nest which Ukrainians can assume and use at any time. But Ukrainians also receive heavy fire. That is why all streets are covered in debris due to the constant use of artillery by Russians. Whenever Ukrainians get out of cover, they are always running even when they are not in the combat zone. The recent deterioration of weather conditions actually helped Russians a lot since infantry fights became almost impossible on the fields. All Russian artillery in the region could concentrate their fire just on Bakhmut with an increased rate of shelling. The useful life of buildings that Ukrainians are using for cover rapidly shortened. This is the main factor that contributed to recent Russian gains in the central part of the city. In the southern part, the Ukrainian 83rd Mechanized Brigade still continues to hold the line. Recent footage shows that they are in active defense and tried to counterattack Russian positions whenever possible. Today, drone operators from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade helped to eliminate yet another Russian squad that tried to hide in the house on the outskirts. The continuous high level of coordination between drone and artillery crews has already resulted in elimination of hundreds, if not thousands of Russian assault men. Only in the southern suburbs because they have been releasing new footage of such operations every day for an extended period of time. In the northern part of the city, the most intense fights are taking place on the territory of the industrial area. Recently released footage indicates that the fights are taking place in the workshops located on the facade of Pavolek. The footage also perfectly displays why moving from one workshop to another is such a difficult task, and why the attackers usually sustain much higher losses than the defenders. Ukrainian fighters from the 1st Border Detachment made holes between the concrete wall plates to throw grenades through them and fire with guns and even RPGs. Overall, the change in weather conditions fostered rapid intensification of fights inside the city because it is the only place where they could continue. The altered setting allowed Russians to focus artillery fire on one place instead of numerous targets along the flanks, and a focused fire started destroying houses much more rapidly. Nonetheless, Ukrainians are keeping the northern and southern front lines very stable. The limited gains that Russian forces managed to secure by totally demolishing the area may actually become their biggest handicap as they reduce the houses in front of them to marble. It became an additional obstacle in the way of the assault units rather than a useful position where they could hide. What do you think about this? As Daily News Team, we will continue to closely follow the developments in Russia and bring you the latest news. Our team spends a great deal of effort to prepare these news. You can support our team for the development of independent journalism. For this, you can use the Super Thanks button below the video. We also carefully read your comments on our news. We would like to know what you think about this incident. What do you think was the purpose of this attack? What do you think about the explosions in Russia, and how do you think this will affect the course of the war? Share your thoughts with us. Follow us for more updates.